Okay, here we go then. Welcome to episode 7 of Knitting Knowledge and Pearls of Wisdom. Thank you so much for joining this Facebook Live. As always, these sessions are posted on my Facebook page, so you can watch them afterwards if you need to catch up. Anyway, I'm Cheryl Lampard. I'm an image consultant. My company is Style Matters International. And I have a passion for sewing and for knitting. And knitting in particular is one of those things that I find extremely therapeutic and relaxing. And this is really why I started these weekly sessions, and you seem to like them. So thank you for keep joining. Hope you can all see and hear me. If not, do put a comment in the box. I can't see as we go along. I'm relying on my trusty helper with the iPad camera to let me know if there's anything I need to adjust or do right. Anyway, let's get started with, I should have said also that I used to own a yarn shop in Brighton, England, and in that yarn shop I often got asked to teach people how to knit, and it was my pleasure to do it then. It's my pleasure all these years later to teach you too, with the wonders of modern technology. So thank you for joining. Okay, this week we are going to talk about two-stranded knitting and correcting errors. Now, we're going to start with correcting errors because with knitting, it's as important to know how to correct knitting mistakes. It's just as an important part of knitting as learning knit and purl. And mistakes happen. They happen to the best of us. I was just perusing some of my books this week, and one book said, well, don't make mistakes in the first place. Well, that's a groundbreaking concept, isn't it? Not to make them in the first place, and pretty unhelpful too, because we all make mistakes. It's frustrating, yes, but unlike sewing where you're cutting into fabric, and that's very hard to rectify if you've cut into some fabric, nearly every knitting mistake can be rectified. So some of the common mistakes, this is just a knit and purl stockinette stitch swatch. Let's say you need to unpick a row or two because you realise you've made a mistake down here. Just use your imagination, pretend you've made a mistake. So you want to unpick a couple of rows. The tendency is to, if you're anything like me, in the past I have gone into a bit of a tantrum, ripped my knitting off the needles, ripped out several rows, and then found that I can't get them back on or I can't find my way back. If it's just a couple of rows, you're much better off by unpicking stitch by stitch. So I'm just going to adjust my position here. So let's say you need to undo a purl row. And I will show you on a knit row too. You want the purl side facing you. And you're literally just going to go into the stitch that you've knitted. And do it slowly to start off with. You soon get up a speed when you're doing this. And hopefully it's not too much. It might only be a few stitches, but this is the way to do it. So you're still controlling what's going on, and you're just placing the needle from the right needle to the left. You're giving some tension on this hand, on your right hand, so that the thread, that your yarn, as you pull it out the stitch, it releases, and then again. Okay, so now I need to undo a knit row. Really, it's exactly the same thing. I'm going to take the yarn in my right hand and I'm going to go stitch by stitch. So this is my first one. I'm going to place my knitting needle. You're keeping the yarn, essentially when you're unpicking your knit stitches, you're keeping the yarn towards the back. When you're unpicking your purl stitches, you're keeping it more towards the front. But try and keep some tension on the yarn as you unpick it. And you're going to have to just drop the thread and then pick it up again. But if you keep some tension on that yarn, you can really see what you're doing with it. Okay. Now I'm not going to do the whole row because I want to show you another thing that is a typical thing. So you might have unpicked your row, but what you've accidentally done is placed your stitch the wrong way round. So can you see here? Let me just unpick a few more so you can see the difference. And this sometimes takes a bit of getting used to, but when you knit a stitch or purl a stitch, it's placed on the needles in a certain way. This is correct, this is correct, this is not. This is correct, this is correct. This one is not. You might find that hard to see, but when you're knitting, you'll understand. But if I knit that as it is now, it's going to look twisted. I'll show you. So I'm just going to knit over my, this is my stitch. You can actually see that quite clearly now. This one is twisted. This one is not. But if I knit it, you will see that it's twisted in your knitting, and that's not what you want. If you can see here, this sits differently. If you were knitting in a fluffy yarn, it probably wouldn't notice, but if it's a smooth yarn and basically stockinette stitch, you would notice. So the remedy is literally just to pick up your stitch and turn it round. So I'll show you again. I had placed this, I did it deliberately so you could see. It's twisted. We don't want that. We want it the right way round. So it's almost, it sort of leans one way slightly. Same thing if you were doing a purl row, you would be able to see if it had twisted. So let me just go back this way. So if I had placed that on the wrong way around on my purl row, you could see that there. If you're worried about, I can't see any difference, don't fret about that. It's just something you will get used to seeing, and you'll notice it. You'll certainly notice it after you've knitted it wrongly, but it's just a case of recognizing it when you do see it. Okay. So what if we drop a stitch? Okay, I'm going to drop this one, and I'm going to make sure I'm going to pull it out quite a long way. Oh my goodness. Okay, now I've dropped a stitch as I'm knitting it. The famous knitting stitch, knit one, drop one. We've all done that. How do I pick that up? What a mess. Well, you could make that into something decorative, but unless that's what the intention was, you probably wouldn't want to leave it like that. So how do I pick it up? Well, the first thing is not to panic. And obviously, if you can make the mistakes, you know, as soon as you recognize them, that's a good thing. So really, this isn't so bad, as long as you can track this loop. So the first thing is to kind of rescue this, the stitch, so it can't run any further. This is just a cable needle, but you can use all sorts of things. You can use, a good thing to use is a crochet hook. I'll show you how to use that in a minute. You can use just a double pointed needle, a cable needle. You can use this hooky thing here. I'm not sure what this is. It is a device for picking up drop stitches. I don't know what it's actually called, but it's got like a crochet hook on the end. This is going to be too small for this thick yarn, so I'm not going to use that today. But you could use anything that you have to hand, and you could even use just another knitting needle. So the important thing is to save it. I am going to show you how to do it with a crochet hook because it's pretty handy if you have a crochet hook. So if I'm picking up my knit stitch, I've saved my drop stitch. All I'm going to do now is hook that through. There we go. Hook the yarn, that loose thread above, hook it, pull it through. Hook it, pull it through. Hook it, pull it through. And now I can put my stitch safely back on my needle. Okay, so that's if we dropped it on a knit row. What if we drop it on a purl row? Pretty much the same thing. I'm going to drop this stitch this time. I'll pull it a little bit, and you discover that we've all done it. It's very easily done. Okay, so I want to rescue my stitch. Now, in this instance, I don't have a crochet hook. Let's say we don't have a crochet hook. What you're going to do here, you need to get the yarn in front of the stitch, and you're kind of going to pick it up and get it back on like that. Okay, it's easier with a crochet hook, but if you don't have one, so I'm going to have my yarn in front of my purl stitch, going to pull it up, and so on and so on. You might need to use your other fingers and oh, I've made a mess of that. Okay, other fingers and thumbs here, but you can do it. Just take your time. That which is dropped can be found. There we go. Okay, and knitting is very forgiving. You can, just ease it back into place. Okay, so that's some very common mistakes there. Now in knitting, you may hear about things called lifelines. Lifelines are literally, you put a row of thread, and you would normally do this. Oh, cameraman's telling me to go back a bit. Yes, thank you. So you would normally do this after maybe this, obviously this is just stocking stitch, but suspend your belief and imagine that this is I've just done a very complicated row. And I know that row is correct. But if I make a mistake beyond that, I need to put in a lifeline so that I know where to maybe pull out my knitting without having to pull out that complicated row. So all I would do, I would get a very thin, fine yarn and weave it in with a needle, exactly as I have done further down, where I've suddenly realized this was another challenging row and I forgot to put in my lifeline. I can go back and do that. And what I've done, I've got my very thin yarn, and literally all I'm doing is, picking up, let's see which row I'm on here. Okay. No, it's not going to do any harm to the knitting, but it shows me that if I have made a mistake, I know that all this is good knitting, but now if I've made a mistake somewhere here, the furthest I have to go back to is there, because I don't want to unpick that challenging row. If you don't have any thin yarn, you can actually use some dental floss. Clean, of course, unused dental floss, but you can do the same thing. So I have done that lifeline. Let me show you how I did that one. Literally, I've got a knitting sewing needle. I still call these a bodkin. And I'm just doing this. That's all I'm going to do. So even if you don't have any thin yarn lying about, you've probably got a bit of dental floss or something, could even be a bit of sewing thread. Whatever you've got, you can use it. And hopefully you never need it. If you do, it's there. And that's why it's called a lifeline. Okay. So you can't see it. It's not going to disrupt your knitting, but it's there should you need it. Okay. Right. Let's get on to, sorry, I've got to lean across the camera for a moment, to two-stranded knitting. I'm putting these little cards up, so if you need to come back to this, you can fast forward to the bit that you want to see. Okay. Right. Two-stranded knitting. It's sometimes called ferrule knitting. That's actually not quite correct. I'm just going to show you the cover of this book, which I've had for many, many years. This covers all sorts of traditional knitting, including ferrule, but you'll have seen these sort of patterns. Ferrule knitting. They come from the Scottish island, and it's called ferrule. But it should really be called two-stranded knitting, because you're actually knitting with two strands, two different colours at the same time. And it is a technique that's used in ferrule, but it's also used in many other knitting styles: Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic, several other techniques for knitting with two colours. So we'll call it two-stranded knitting. Last week, so this is two-stranded knitting. This is a sample that I've done. Okay. This is a traditional, actually, it is a traditional ferrule pattern from that book. Anyway, that's a sample I've done. I'm coming back to that in a moment, but I just want to show you. Last week we talked about intarsia knitting, which is two-colour knitting or more, but you're actually knitting in blocks of colour. You're knitting different blocks of colour, and you're twisting the yarn when you change colour so you don't get a hole. And you can see very clearly there's designated blocks of colour. You can see where I've twisted my yarn. All good. With two-stranded knitting, it's a bit more complicated because what you're actually doing, and I'm going to flip this over, you're stranding the yarn. You're working two yarns at the same time. You're actually stranding as you knit. Now there's a technique to that because these are called floats. And there's kind of two ways to do this. You can carry the floats across the back of the knitting, and that's just fine. And you kind of you weave them in, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute, every few stitches. But the problem is, if you have very large floats, and with this thickness of yarn, this is only 3 stitches. That's actually quite a big float. If you were to put that on as a sweater, it's very easy to catch your fingers in that, to catch your rings or anything, and it's annoying because you're going to then disrupt the knitting, you're going to disrupt the finished garment, you're going to have snags and pulls. So the other way to do it is to weave in as you go. And I know this looks a mess at the back, but you can quite clearly see here we have these long floats where the pattern actually has to go across several stitches before I change the colour. And here, where I've woven my floats in, I've woven my yarn in every couple of stitches. So you get a much neater background. You get a much neater reverse of the garment is what I'm trying to say there. There's less chance of catching your fingers. And what you get with both is a very thick fabric, so it's wonderful for a really thick winter sweater or, you know, an outer garment. It's really warm because you've got double thread all the time. But it can be tricky to knit because keeping control of those floats can really alter your tension. You still need to have the right amount of spring and the right gauge for your knitted piece. Now, although I've done 2 different methods here, I can assure you that the gauge is exactly the same, and if I lay one on top of the other, you'll see that they match perfectly. But that's because I've done it for a long time. I know how to do it. But when you start off, this can be tricky. So I'm going to show you how to do 2 colours at the same time, and how you sort of wrangle the yarn. Okay, I've started off with some purple here. I'm going to drop my purple to the ground so that it runs freely. I'm not going to work in a particular pattern here. I'm just going to show you how to do it. So I've just cast on here a number of stitches in my purple yarn. To make it a bit easier for you, again, this is back to as last week, we wound yarn onto bobbins, because if you have 2 big balls of yarn going at the same time, actually it's going to tighten up your gauge, it's going to tighten up your knitting, and then you're going to find that your knitting is a bit sort of corrugated at the end of it. So I would strongly suggest to wind your yarn, if it's not your main colour, wind that colour onto bobbins. And you know, you might have to have several bobbins. So I'm going to show you I'm just going to adjust my position so the camera can see what I'm doing. I'm just going to start with my second colour. I am going to knot it. I don't always when I'm doing 2 colour stranded knitting because it seems to hold itself, but again, all these knots can be undone and woven in afterwards. Right, I'm just going to do a very simple 1 stitch in purple and 1 in this beige. So my next stitch is in beige, and I'm going to go across the row like this because I want you to see what's happening. I suggest keep 1 colour at the top, if you will. Now, how do you hold the yarn? Well, as you get more advanced, there are ways you can hold it in your left hand and flip the stitch through. You can actually hold it like this with 2 yarns going at the same time. But to start off with, I recommend just dropping 1 yarn and picking up the other. Yes, it takes longer, but you'll get a better feel for it as a beginner. It's much easier to manage. But when I say keep 1 yarn at the top, I'm going to keep my purple above the beige. So I'm going to go under with the beige. So remember, I'm just doing one stitch purple, and some patterns do have this kind of checkerboard approach, but I want you to see what's happening at the back. I just need to undo some more yarn there on my bobbin. So 1 and 1. Don't make it tight. And as you go along with your knitting, you can always give it a little stretch, just to make sure. It's always better if you're working with 2 colors, if you're knitting and your stranding is a little bit looser than tight. If it's too tight, you can't fix it afterwards. If it's too loose, you can. You can just slightly tighten up those looser stitches. So I'm keeping, this is my beige, so I'm keeping that underneath the purple. Whichever way you choose is fine, whether it's your main color or your contrast color, but just be consistent with it. Okay, I'm going to turn this around so you can see what that looks like. So you can see that's what I mean by I've kept my purple at the top so that my beige is running below it. Now on the way back, I'm going to alternate this. I'm still going to keep my purple at the top, but I'm going to knit purple, or pearl purple in this instance, other than my end stitch. I'm going to keep my purple at the top, keep my beige running along underneath. So at the moment I'm just trying to untangle my yarn, which happens, but that's okay. My purple is running along the top, my beige is underneath. The reason you try and keep that consistent is that on the right side, if you don't, just the yarn underneath actually bizarrely has further to travel than the yarn at the top. Oh, I've done 2 pearls there. Oh, look, talk about going backwards on my stitching. I'm picking. Good example. Okay. This yarn doesn't have as far to travel as the beige yarn. So if you keep going the same way, there's some consistency there on how the colour looks on the right side. If you're constantly going up and under with your different colour yarns, then you get a slightly different colour dominance, shall we say. The contrast colour can look a bit diminished, it can look a bit pulled. It doesn't matter if you're keeping it consistent, but if you're not, it's going to notice. I'm sorry, I look a bit cack-handed here because I'm knitting at an awkward angle so that the camera can see. That's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. Now here, I'm just going to do a knit one. You don't have to do that there. That's just a force of habit. So you see, I'm bringing in my colours, and that's every row. I'm just going to give it a little stretch to see how it is. Now let's say, then that's easy. So if your design was just a checkerboard design and you were doing the contrast all the time, that would be fine. But let's say I've got to strand it across a bigger run of stitches. Now, some of this, how many stitches before you strand it, will really depend on the thickness of your yarn. As I showed you in that sample with the blue or the teal colour and the white, 3 stitches on that thick yarn is quite big. This is the same yarn, so 3 stitches is quite a long float. If it's very fine yarn, 3 stitches is probably fine. So you have to think about the yarn that you're using and how that the length of that float. Okay, so this time I'm going to do 3 stitches. Now I'm going to bring in my beige yarn and I'm going to do 5 stitches. But 5's really too much for me to have a float because my purple now has got to go all that way. So what do? This is where we're stranding this. I'm going to bring my beige up and just literally loop my purple. Okay. Now I need to do, see what I mean by keeping that loose? If you make that too tight across the width of a sweater, that's going to make it way too small, and the knitting's going to look very pulled. Much better to have that a bit looser. You can always tighten that up as you go. So now I'm going to bring my purple back in. I'm going to do 3 stitches of my purple. Okay. Don't look at this pattern. It's just a made up one as I go along to show you. So now I'm going to bring my beige, and I'm going to do another 5 stitches, but I've got to control that float, and I'm going to do that maybe after 3 stitches. Going to catch my purple. Okay, and I'm going to finish off with 2 purples. And then I'll show you what it looks like on the back, and we'll just do one more row. So there you can see I've stranded my purple and my beige. I'm not going any more than 3 stitches. I still think that's actually a bit large for this type of yarn. I would probably do every 2 stitches, but the principle is the same. Let's go back. I'm going to keep the purple going for a moment. Now I want to go to my beige. Now remember from last week, if I just pick up here, I'm going to get a hole. So I've got to twist that. I'm twisting that purple with the beige. Okay. I want my purple to run along the top. Once I get there. Now, I want to twist, I'm going to twist in a different point there. Sorry, I'm going to twist actually after 2 stitches there, because I already twisted that after 3. I don't always want it in the same place, because you can sometimes get show through. Okay, remember now I'm going back to my purple, so I've got to twist that, although I'm keeping the beige going, but I'm going to get a hole otherwise. Oh, I'm confusing you. I'm so sorry. I'm confusing you. I need my purple there. I am confusing you. Okay. Let me just clarify. I twisted my purple there because I've got 5 stitches. I'm moving my purple over so I can knit that stitch, purl that stitch and those. Now I can bring my beige in. But if I was coming to where I needed to change colours and I had a gap, I would have to twist that. Okay, I just bring that in there. Now I'm going to twist this on the 3rd stitch. I twisted it in the row before on the 2nd stitch, so now I want to do it on the 3rd, just to even it up. I apologize if I confused you there. So essentially that's what you're doing. But you can see how long those floats still are. I would probably do it every 2 stitches. This, remember, was every one. That's perfect. But, you know, that was the pattern there. This is now a different pattern, such as it is. But you can see I've still got a nice amount of stretch and spring. Do be careful if you decide that your main colour is going to be a light colour and you want to bring in a dark colour, because those strands can show through. So you might need to think about your colour placement when you're doing 2-stranded knitting, and how much stranding of a darker colour is going across a light colour. Okay, I know that sounds really quite challenging. It's actually not. Just practice it. It feels very clunky at first, but honestly, you do get into a rhythm with it. There are other ways to hold the yarn, but I suggest practicing with that to start off with. I hope that was helpful, albeit challenging. I know two-stranded knitting can be time consuming, but it is worth it, and you do get a lovely result. And once you start doing it, you'll find that you develop a rhythm for it. The key thing is to keep the floats nice and loose. It's better to have them loose than tight, and make sure that you give your knitting a little stretch every row, and you'll get a feel for how you knit. So any questions, any problems, please drop me a line during the week. I'll be happy to answer them. We can always go over it again next week if you need me to. Don't get stressed about anything. It's knitting, remember. So until next week, keep calm, stay home, stay safe, keep calm, and keep knitting. Bye-bye for now.